You know what's crazy? There is one decision made by a single person that literally saved more lives than any war has ever taken. And the person who made it? They got absolutely nothing for it. No money, no fame while they were alive, and the world almost forgot about them entirely. So picture this. It's 1928 in London. A guy named Alexander Fleming comes back from vacation and walks into his lab. Now, most people would just start working. Maybe grab some coffee, complain about being back at work. But Fleming notices something weird. One of his petri dishes that was supposed to be growing bacteria, it had mold on it. And here's the thing, around that mold the bacteria were dead. Just gone. Now, any other scientist probably would have thrown that dish away, cleaned up, and moved on with their day. But Fleming didn't do that. He looked at it and thought, wait a second, what if this mold is actually killing the bacteria? That moment right there, that single decision to investigate instead of just tossing it in the trash, that changed everything. But here's what nobody tells you about this story. Fleming didn't just discover penicillin and suddenly everyone started using it. That's not how it happened at all. In fact, for more than a decade, almost nobody cared. Fleming published his findings in 1929, and the medical community basically ignored him. Can you imagine that? You discover something that could save millions of lives, and everyone just goes, yeah, whatever, we're busy. The real story of how penicillin actually became the medicine we know today is way more complicated and honestly way more interesting than what they teach you in school. Because it involves a world war, a dying police officer, and two scientists who were desperate enough to try something that everyone else thought was impossible. But before we get to that, we need to understand what the world was like before this discovery. And trust me, it was absolutely terrifying. Think about this for a second. Before penicillin, people died from paper cuts. No, seriously. You could get a tiny cut on your finger, it could get infected, and you could die. That's not an exaggeration. That's just how life was. Childbirth? Incredibly dangerous, not just because of the birth itself, but because of infections afterward. Surgery? Forget about it. Even if the surgery went perfectly, you might die a few days later from an infection. Pneumonia was basically a death sentence. Tuberculosis killed millions of people every single year. Syphilis, gonorrhea, all these bacterial infections that we can treat easily now with a simple course of antibiotics. They were just slowly killing people, and there was nothing doctors could do about it. Let me tell you about what World War I was really like. Yeah, the fighting was horrible, but you know what killed more soldiers than bullets and bombs? Infections. A soldier could survive getting shot, make it to a field hospital, and then die a week later because their wound got infected. Doctors would amputate limbs not because they were too damaged to save, but because if they didn't, the infection would spread and kill the patient. Gas gangrene was this nightmare infection that would spread so fast that you could literally watch someone's tissue dying in front of your eyes. And there was nothing, absolutely nothing, that could stop it. Doctors tried everything. They used antiseptics, they used heat. They tried chemical compounds that were so harsh they would burn healthy tissue, just hoping it would kill the bacteria faster than it killed the patient. Some treatments were almost as bad as the infections themselves. They used mercury compounds for syphilis that would literally poison people. The treatment might take years, and it might not even work, and in the meantime, you're being slowly poisoned by mercury. That was the best option available. So that's the world Fleming was living in when he made his discovery. But like I said, nobody really cared at first. And there's actually a good reason for that. Fleming found that this mold, which he named penicillin after the type of mold it came from, Penicillium, could kill bacteria in a petri dish. Great. But getting from a petri dish to actually treating a person, that's a completely different challenge. Fleming tried to purify penicillin, tried to make enough of it to use as a medicine, and he just couldn't figure it out. The stuff was really unstable, it broke down quickly, and he couldn't produce it in any meaningful quantity. So Fleming published his paper, showed that penicillin could kill bacteria in a lab, and then basically gave up on trying to turn it into a practical medicine. He moved on to other research. And for the next 10 years, penicillin was just this interesting scientific curiosity that a few people knew about, but nobody was doing anything with. Meanwhile, people kept dying from infections that this substance could have cured. Thousands of people every single day, dying from things that could have been prevented. Now here's where the story gets really interesting. It's 1938, and there's a scientist at Oxford University named Florey. He's an Australian pathologist, and he's working with this German Jewish biochemist named Ernst Boris, who had fled Nazi Germany. Chain is going through old medical literature, just reading old papers, and he comes across Fleming's paper about penicillin from almost 10 years earlier. And Chain thinks, this is interesting. Nobody ever followed up on this. What if we could actually make this work? So Chain brings this to Florey, and they decide to investigate. But they're not just doing this out of curiosity. It's 1939 now, and World War II has started. They know that if this war is anything like the last one, infections are going to kill thousands of soldiers. They know they need something, anything, that can fight bacterial infections. So they start working on penicillin, trying to solve all the problems that Fleming couldn't solve. How do you grow enough of the mold? How do you extract the penicillin? How do you purify it? How do you keep it stable? And let me tell you, this was incredibly hard. They didn't have the technology we have today. They're doing this with basic lab equipment, working with tiny amounts of material, and every step was a struggle. They had to grow the mold in these special flasks, and they needed hundreds of flasks just to get a tiny amount of penicillin. Then they had to extract it, which required figuring out the right solvents and techniques. Then they had to purify it without destroying it because this stuff breaks down really easily. They worked on this for months, making tiny bits of progress, hitting dead ends, trying new approaches. Finally, in 1940, they managed to produce a small amount of purified penicillin. Not much, but enough to test. So they did what scientists do. They tested it on mice. They infected 8 mice with deadly bacteria, and then they treated 4 of them with penicillin. The other 4 got nothing. By the next morning, the 4 mice that didn't get penicillin were dead. The 4 that got penicillin, completely fine, running around like nothing had happened. This was it. This was proof that penicillin could actually work as a medicine, but they still had a problem. A big problem. They needed to test it on humans, and that meant they needed a lot more penicillin than they had. Growing the mold was slow and difficult, and extracting and purifying the penicillin was even harder. They were producing tiny amounts, and they needed much more. So they basically turned their entire lab into a penicillin factory. They had containers everywhere growing mold. They had a team of people working around the clock extracting and purifying. They even used hospital bedpans as containers because they needed any vessel they could get their hands on. After months of this, by early 1941, they finally had enough penicillin to try it on a person. And this is where we get to that dying police officer I mentioned earlier. His name was Albert Alexander, and his story is honestly heartbreaking. Albert was a 43-year-old police constable, and he got scratched by a rose thorn while he was gardening. That's it. A rose thorn, such a small thing. But that scratch got infected, and the infection spread. By the time he got to the hospital, the infection had spread to his face, his scalp, his eyes. He had abscesses all over. His eye was so infected they had to remove it. He was dying, and everyone knew it. The doctors had tried everything available at the time, all the antiseptics, all the treatments. Nothing was working. So Florey and Chain asked if they could try penicillin on Albert. At this point, what did he have to lose? They started giving him injections of penicillin on February 12, 1941, and what happened next was absolutely miraculous. Within 24 hours, his fever went down. The infection started clearing up. He started feeling better. After a few days, he was sitting up in bed, eating normally, talking, looking like he was actually going to survive this. Everyone was amazed. This stuff actually worked. It was like watching someone come back from the dead, but then disaster struck. They ran out of penicillin. See, they had only produced a small amount. And they were even collecting Albert's urine and re-extracting penicillin from it to try to make their supply last longer. Yeah, you heard that right. They were recycling penicillin from his pee because they were that desperate to keep treating him. But even that wasn't enough. On March 15th, just a month after they started treating him, they ran out completely. And without the penicillin, the infection came back. And on March 15th, 1941, Albert Alexander died. Can you imagine how devastating that must have been? They had proof that penicillin worked. They had saved this man, brought him back from the brink of death. And then they had to watch him die anyway because they didn't have enough medicine. But as tragic as this was, it proved something crucial. Penicillin worked on humans. It could cure infections that nothing else could touch. They just needed to figure out how to make enough of it. So Florey and Chain kept working, kept trying to scale up production. They treated a few more patients with the small amounts they could produce, And every case that survived was more proof that this was the real deal. But they had another problem now. Britain was in the middle of World War II, being bombed by Germany, and there just weren't resources available to build a massive penicillin production facility. The British pharmaceutical companies were already stretched thin making other medicines and dealing with factories being bombed. Nobody had the capacity to take on this huge new project. So Florey made a decision: he would go to America. In 1941, he traveled to the United States with a sample of the penicillin mold, and he started meeting with American pharmaceutical companies and government officials, trying to convince them to help mass-produce penicillin. And at first it was tough. A lot of companies were skeptical. This was going to require a massive investment, new facilities, new techniques, and there was no guarantee it would work on a large scale. But Florey kept pushing, kept showing them the data, kept telling them about the patients who had been saved. And then, in December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and the United States entered World War II. Suddenly, the government and the military were very interested in anything that could save soldiers' lives. They remembered what happened in World War I, how infections killed so many soldiers, and they wanted to prevent that this time. So the US government got involved, pushing pharmaceutical companies to work on penicillin production, offering funding and support. Several companies started working on it, trying different methods to grow the mold and extract the penicillin more efficiently. One of the big breakthroughs came from a lab technician named Mary Hunt. She worked at a research lab in Peoria, Illinois, where they were trying to find better strains of the Penicillium mold that would produce more penicillin. Mary's job was to go around to local markets and bring back moldy fruits and vegetables to test. She became known as Moldy Mary. And one day, in 1943, she brought back a moldy cantaloupe from a local market. They tested the mold on that cantaloupe, and it turned out to be a much better penicillin producer than the original strain Fleming had found. This new strain could produce more than 200 times the amount of penicillin. That one moldy cantaloupe became the ancestor of the mold used to produce most of the penicillin made today. Meanwhile, the companies were figuring out better ways to grow the mold and extract the penicillin. Instead of growing it in flasks, they developed these huge, deep fermentation tanks where they could grow massive amounts of mold. They figured out better purification techniques. They worked out how to keep the penicillin stable. By 1943, they were producing enough penicillin to start using it widely. By 1944, they were producing enough to treat all the Allied soldiers who needed it. And by 1945, they were making so much that it became available for civilian use too. And the impact was immediate and dramatic. During World War II, penicillin saved hundreds of thousands of soldiers' lives. Infections that would have killed or crippled soldiers in previous wars were now curable. The death rate from bacterial pneumonia in soldiers dropped dramatically. Syphilis and gonorrhea, which had been major problems in the military, could now be cured quickly and easily. Wounded soldiers who would have died from infected wounds were now surviving and recovering. It was such a game-changer that it was called the war's greatest lifesaver. But the impact went way beyond the war. Once penicillin became available to the public, it changed medicine completely. Childbirth became so much safer because doctors could now treat infections that used to kill new mothers. Surgery became safer because post-surgical infections could be treated. Diseases that had killed millions of people for all of human history, like pneumonia and tuberculosis, were now curable. Life expectancy started going up. Child mortality rates dropped. Penicillin didn't just save lives, it changed what it meant to be alive. People stopped living in constant fear of infections. And here's the thing, penicillin was just the beginning. Once scientists figured out that molds and other microorganisms could produce antibiotics, they started looking for more. They found streptomycin, which could treat tuberculosis. They found tetracycline, which worked on all sorts of infections. They found vancomycin and erythromycin and dozens of other antibiotics. The discovery of penicillin opened up an entire new field of medicine. We call the period after World War II the golden age of antibiotics because so many new ones were discovered and developed. But let's go back to the people in this story because what happened to them is really interesting. Alexander Fleming became famous. Once the world realized how important penicillin was, Fleming got all the credit. He was knighted. He won the Nobel Prize in 1945 along with Florey and Chain. He became this celebrated figure, giving lectures all over the world, and to be fair, he deserved recognition. He was the one who first noticed that the mold killed bacteria. But here's the thing. Florey and Chain were the ones who actually made penicillin into a practical medicine. They were the ones who solved all the hard problems, who did years of difficult research, who pushed to get it mass-produced. But Florey didn't like being in the spotlight. He was a scientist, not a public figure, and he was happy to let Fleming take most of the credit. Chain was a bit more bitter about it. He felt like Fleming got way too much recognition for the initial discovery and Florey didn't get enough credit for actually making it work. And honestly, he had a point. The public story became that Fleming discovered penicillin and changed the world, while Florey and Chain became footnotes. Most people today have heard of Alexander Fleming, but how many people know about Howard Florey or Ernst Boris Chain? And here's something else that's interesting. Fleming didn't patent penicillin, neither did Florey or Chain. They could have. They could have made billions of dollars. But they felt like this was too important, that it needed to be freely available to everyone. So they let pharmaceutical companies make and sell penicillin without paying them any royalties. Can you imagine making a discovery that saves millions of lives and that would make you incredibly wealthy and just giving it away? That's what they did. They thought it was the right thing to do. Now, the story of penicillin isn't perfect. Like with any powerful tool, there are downsides. One of the big problems we're facing now is antibiotic resistance. See bacteria evolve. When you use antibiotics a lot, you kill off the bacteria that are susceptible to them. But any bacteria that happen to have mutations that make them resistant survive and reproduce. Over time, you get more and more resistant bacteria. And we've used antibiotics so much, often when we didn't really need to, that we've created these superbugs that are resistant to multiple antibiotics. Some infections that used to be easy to treat are becoming harder to cure. There's also the issue of how antibiotics have been used in agriculture. Farmers give antibiotics to livestock, not just to treat infections, but to make the animals grow faster. This means we're using massive amounts of antibiotics, which creates more opportunities for resistant bacteria to develop. And these resistant bacteria can spread from animals to humans. It's becoming a serious problem, and a lot of scientists are worried that we're heading toward a future where antibiotics don't work anymore, where we're back to the pre-penicillin era of dying from simple infections. But despite these problems, the discovery of penicillin remains one of the most important medical breakthroughs in human history. Before penicillin, the average life expectancy in the United States was about 60 years. Now it's almost 80. A big part of that increase is because of antibiotics. Millions of people are alive today who would have died from infections in the past. Every time you take antibiotics for strep throat or a urinary tract infection or any other bacterial infection, you're benefiting from that decision Fleming made in 1928 to investigate a moldy petri dish instead of throwing it away. Think about your own life for a second. Have you ever taken antibiotics? Probably yes. Maybe for an ear infection when you were a kid, or for strep throat, or after a surgery to prevent infection. Without penicillin and the antibiotics that came after it, you might not be here right now. Your parents might have died from an infection before you were born. Your grandparents might not have survived long enough to have your parents. The population of the entire world would be smaller because so many people would have died from infections. And it all comes back to that one decision. That one moment when Fleming could have just thrown away a contaminated petri dish and moved on with his day, but he didn't. He really looked at it and thought, wait, this is interesting. What if there's something here? That curiosity, that willingness to investigate something unexpected instead of dismissing it, that changed everything. It's a reminder that sometimes the biggest breakthroughs come from paying attention to things that seem small or accidental, from being curious about things that don't quite fit our expectations. But it's also a reminder that discovery alone isn't enough. Fleming's discovery sat unused for more than a decade because nobody could figure out how to turn it into a practical medicine. It took Florey and Chain's determination and years of hard work to make penicillin actually useful. It took the resources of the US government and multiple pharmaceutical companies to mass produce it. It took a world war to create the urgency needed to push everyone to make it happen. One person's discovery was important, but it took a collective effort to turn that discovery into something that could save lives. And here's something I find really fascinating. We talk about penicillin as this miracle drug, and it absolutely is, but the story of how it became available to the world is full of near misses and lucky breaks. What if Fleming had been less observant and just thrown away that petri dish? What if Chain hadn't happened to read Fleming's old paper? What if Florey hadn't been able to get funding for his research? What if they hadn't found that moldy cantaloupe with a better strain of the mold? What if the US hadn't entered World War II and created the urgency to mass-produce penicillin? At so many points, this could have gone differently, and millions more people would have died. It makes you wonder what other potential breakthroughs are sitting in old research papers, ignored because nobody has followed up on them yet. What other observations have scientists made that seemed interesting but not important enough to pursue? How many potential life-saving discoveries are out there waiting for someone to be curious enough to investigate them further? The story of penicillin tells us that we need to pay attention to unexpected results, to follow up on things that seem strange or don't quite make sense, because you never know what you might find. Let's talk about some of the specific ways penicillin changed medicine, because it's pretty incredible when you look at the details. Before penicillin, if you got bacterial meningitis, which is an infection of the membranes around your brain and spinal cord, you had a 90% chance of dying. 90%. And if you survived, you probably had serious brain damage. After penicillin became available, the death rate dropped to less than 20%. That's not perfect, but it's a massive improvement. Thousands of people who would have died or been permanently disabled were now surviving and recovering completely. Rheumatic fever was another big problem before antibiotics. It was caused by untreated strep throat infections, and it could damage your heart valves, leading to heart disease and early death. It was one of the leading causes of death in children and young adults. After penicillin, rheumatic fever became rare because doctors could treat strep throat before it progressed to rheumatic fever. An entire disease that used to kill thousands of people every year was basically eliminated. Syphilis is another interesting case. Before penicillin, syphilis was this terrifying disease that progressed through stages over years. First you'd get sores, then a rash, and if it went untreated, it would eventually attack your brain, your heart, your other organs. It caused insanity, paralysis, and death. The treatment was mercury or arsenic compounds that were almost as bad as the disease. Paul Ehrlich developed a drug called salvarsan in 1909 that was better than mercury but still pretty toxic, and treatment required dozens of injections over months or years. After penicillin, syphilis could be cured with a single injection. One shot, and you were cured. It was almost miraculous. Even childbirth changed dramatically. Before antibiotics, puerperal fever, which is an infection after childbirth, killed about 1 in every 100 women who gave birth. Sometimes it was even higher during epidemics. Women were literally risking their lives every time they had a baby. Doctors tried to prevent infections by washing their hands and sterilizing equipment, and that helped, but infections still happened. After penicillin, puerperal fever became rare and easily treatable. Childbirth went from being one of the most dangerous things a woman could do to being relatively safe. Surgery also changed completely. Before antibiotics, surgeons would avoid doing certain operations because the risk of infection was too high. Even routine surgeries were risky. Appendicitis, which is super common, was really dangerous. If your appendix burst before they could remove it, you'd probably die from the infection. After penicillin, surgeons could do much more complex operations because they could prevent and treat infections. Heart surgery, organ transplants, joint replacements, all of these became possible because of antibiotics. And it wasn't just about treating infections. Antibiotics also allowed doctors to prevent infections in situations where they were likely. Before surgery, patients get antibiotics to prevent infection. People with certain heart conditions take antibiotics before dental work to prevent bacteria from entering their bloodstream and causing heart infections. People who have been exposed to certain diseases take antibiotics to prevent getting sick. Antibiotics didn't just treat disease, they prevented it. The economic impact was huge too. Before penicillin, infectious diseases kept people out of work for weeks or months, or killed them when they were in their most productive years. Businesses lost workers, families lost breadwinners, communities lost members. The economic cost of all those sick and dying people was enormous. After penicillin, people who got sick could be treated quickly and get back to work. Productivity went up, economic growth accelerated. Some economists have estimated that antibiotics have contributed trillions of dollars to the global economy by keeping people healthy and productive. But let's get back to the people in this story because there are some interesting details about their lives that don't usually get told. Alexander Fleming was actually kind of a strange guy. He was shy and didn't like public speaking, which must have been tough when he became famous and everyone wanted to hear from him. He was also known for being a bit messy in the lab, which is actually how he discovered penicillin in the first place. If he had been neater and cleaned up his petri dishes regularly, he might never have noticed the mold-killing bacteria. So his sloppiness, which would usually be considered a bad trait in a scientist, turned out to be the key to one of the most important discoveries in medicine. Howard Florey was Australian, and he was really proud of that. Even though he spent most of his career in England, he never forgot where he came from. After penicillin became famous, Australia claimed him as a national hero, and he's on the Australian $50 bill. He was a tough, no-nonsense guy who worked incredibly hard and expected the same from everyone around him. He didn't care about fame or credit, he just wanted to solve problems and help people. That's probably why he was okay with Fleming getting most of the public recognition. Ernst Boris Chain had a really interesting background. He was born in Germany to a Jewish-Russian father and a German mother. He was a talented musician and almost became a professional pianist before deciding to become a scientist. When the Nazis came to power in Germany, he knew he had to leave because of his Jewish heritage. He moved to England in 1933 and started working at Oxford, which is where he met Florey. If the Nazis hadn't risen to power, Chain might never have gone to England, and he might never have worked on penicillin. So in a weird way, one of the most horrible events in history indirectly led to one of the most beneficial medical discoveries. Chain was also really interested in the chemistry of penicillin. He won the Nobel Prize not just for helping develop penicillin as a medicine, but for figuring out its chemical structure. Understanding exactly what penicillin was and how it worked helped scientists develop other antibiotics. After the war, Chain moved back to Europe and continued working on antibiotics and other biochemistry research. He lived until 1979 and saw how antibiotics changed the world. Mary Hunt, Moldy Mary, who found that super-productive cantaloupe mold, didn't get much recognition at the time. She was just a lab technician doing her job. But that moldy cantaloupe she found made a huge difference in how much penicillin could be produced, which meant how many lives could be saved. She's a good reminder that important contributions to science don't always come from famous scientists. Sometimes they come from people doing seemingly small tasks who happen to make just the right observation at just the right time. There were also a lot of other scientists and workers who contributed to making penicillin a reality. The engineers who designed the fermentation tanks, the chemists who worked out the purification processes, the factory workers who produced the penicillin, the nurses and doctors who figured out how to use it effectively. It was a massive collaborative effort involving thousands of people. But that's how most big scientific and medical breakthroughs actually happen. We like to tell stories about individual genius and individual discoveries are important, but turning those discoveries into something useful almost always requires lots of people working together. Now let's talk about the future, because the story of antibiotics isn't over. We're facing some serious challenges. Antibiotic resistance is getting worse, and we're not developing new antibiotics as fast as we need to. Why? Because making new antibiotics isn't very profitable for pharmaceutical companies. Think about it, if a company develops a new antibiotic, doctors will only use it as a last resort for infections that are resistant to other antibiotics. They want to save the new antibiotic so bacteria don't develop resistance to it too quickly. But that means the company can't sell much of it, so they can't make back the billions of dollars it costs to develop a new drug. A lot of pharmaceutical companies have stopped working on new antibiotics because the economics don't make sense. This is a real problem. We need new antibiotics, but the normal market incentives aren't working. Some people are proposing that governments should fund antibiotic development, or that we should change how we pay for antibiotics, so companies can still make money even if the drugs aren't used much. It is a complex problem that we need to solve because if we don't keep developing new antibiotics, we could end up in a situation where common infections become deadly again, just like before penicillin. Scientists are also looking for completely new approaches to fighting bacterial infections. Maybe instead of antibiotics, we could use bacteriophages, which are viruses that kill bacteria. Or maybe we could develop treatments that help the immune system fight infections better. Or maybe we could find ways to prevent resistant bacteria from spreading. There are lots of ideas being explored, but none of them are ready to replace antibiotics yet. We also need to be smarter about how we use the antibiotics we have. That means doctors need to only prescribe antibiotics when they're really needed, not for viral infections where they don't work anyway. It means patients need to take the full course of antibiotics even if they feel better, because stopping early can allow resistant bacteria to survive and multiply. It means farmers need to stop using antibiotics in healthy animals just to make them grow faster. These are all things we can do right now to slow down the development of resistance. But even with all these challenges, the discovery of penicillin remains one of the greatest success stories in human history. It's a story about curiosity, about perseverance, about people working together to solve hard problems. It is a story about how one observation can change the world if enough people care enough to follow through on it. It's a story about how science and medicine can make life better for everyone. And it's a story that reminds us that progress isn't inevitable. Penicillin didn't have to become the widely available medicine that it is today. It took specific people making specific decisions at specific times. Fleming could have ignored that moldy petri dish. Florey and Chain could have worked on something else. The US government could have decided not to fund mass production. At each step, people chose to move forward, to invest time and money and effort into making this work. And because they made those choices, millions of people are alive today who otherwise wouldn't be. So the next time you take antibiotics, or the next time you hear about someone recovering from an infection that would have killed them 100 years ago, remember this story. Remember that one person noticed something unusual and decided to investigate it. Remember that other people saw potential in that discovery and worked for years to make it useful. Remember that a whole society came together to mass produce and distribute a medicine that could save lives. Remember that none of this was inevitable, that it took curiosity and hard work and collaboration and a bit of luck. And maybe think about what unexpected observations you're dismissing in your own life. What weird things are happening around you that you're ignoring because they don't fit your expectations? What problems could you solve if you were curious enough to really investigate them? What could you discover if you paid attention to the things that seemed strange instead of just moving on? You might not discover the next penicillin, but then again, Fleming didn't expect to either. He just noticed something interesting and followed where it led, and that changed everything. The story of penicillin is ultimately a story about hope. It shows us that terrible problems can be solved, that diseases that have killed people for all of human history can be defeated, that we can make the world better if we're willing to work at it. It's easy to be pessimistic, to think that things can't change, that problems are too big to solve. But penicillin proves that's not true. One discovery, pursued by determined people, supported by a society that saw its value, saved more lives than we can count. If that's possible, what else is possible? We live in a world where bacterial infections are mostly just an annoyance instead of a death sentence. We live in a world where children don't regularly die from diseases that used to be common. We live in a world where surgeons can perform operations that would have been impossible 100 years ago. We live in a world that's better in this fundamental way because of penicillin. And we should be grateful for that, and we should remember the people who made it happen. And we should think about what we can do to keep making the world better. Because the work isn't done. Antibiotic resistance is a real threat. New diseases keep emerging. There are still infections we can't treat effectively. There's still work to do, problems to solve, discoveries to make. The story of penicillin isn't just history, it's a template for how we can tackle the challenges we face today. Notice things that don't quite fit, investigate them, work together. Persevere through setbacks, and keep pushing forward until you find a solution. That's how penicillin happened, and that's how the next breakthrough will happen too. So yeah, one decision changed modern medicine. Fleming's decision to investigate a moldy petri dish instead of throwing it away. But really, it was a series of decisions by many people that turned that observation into the medicine that has saved countless lives. And that's an important lesson too. Individual discoveries matter, but so does everything that comes after. So does the work of developing and testing and manufacturing and distributing. So does the society that supports and funds that work. Progress is a team effort. And here we are, more than 90 years after Fleming first noticed that mold-killing bacteria. And we're still benefiting from that discovery every single day. That's the power of science and medicine when they're done right. That's what's possible when people pay attention, ask questions, work hard, and care about making things better. That's why the story of penicillin matters. Not just as history, but as inspiration for what we can accomplish if we try. Now let me tell you something else that most people don't know about the penicillin story. The way it spread around the world after World War II is actually fascinating. When the war ended in 1945, There was this huge surplus of penicillin production capacity in the United States. All these factories had been built to produce penicillin for the war effort, and suddenly the war was over. What were they going to do with all this capacity? Well, they started selling penicillin to civilians, and the price dropped dramatically. What had been an expensive medicine available only to soldiers suddenly became affordable for regular people. But here's the thing. Not every country had access to penicillin right away. The United States and Britain had it. Other allied countries got it pretty quickly. But what about the rest of the world? What about countries that had been on the other side of the war, or countries that hadn't been involved at all? There was this massive inequality in access to this life-saving medicine. And that inequality had real consequences. People in wealthy countries were surviving infections while people in poor countries were still dying from the same infections. This led to a push to make penicillin available globally. The World Health Organization, which was founded in 1948, made antibiotic availability one of its priorities. They worked with countries around the world to help them set up their own penicillin production facilities, or to import penicillin from other countries. It took years, but eventually penicillin became available almost everywhere. And that had a massive impact on global health. Infant mortality rates dropped. Life expectancy increased. Diseases that had been major killers in developing countries became treatable. But even today, there are still inequalities in access to antibiotics. The newest, most effective antibiotics are often only available in wealthy countries because they're expensive. People in poor countries might only have access to older antibiotics, and sometimes those don't work as well, especially for resistant infections. This is one of the ongoing challenges in global health. How do we make sure everyone has access to the medicines they need, regardless of where they live or how much money they have? There's also the question of how antibiotics have changed our relationship with the natural world. Before antibiotics, people were very aware of the danger of infections. They were careful about cleanliness, about avoiding situations where they might get infected. After antibiotics became common, we became less careful. We stopped worrying as much about infections because we knew we could treat them. In some ways, that's good. People are less anxious, more willing to take risks, more able to live normal lives. But in other ways, it's contributed to the problem of antibiotic resistance. We use antibiotics more casually than we should, and that's helping create resistant bacteria. Think about how different medicine was before antibiotics. Doctors spend a lot of their time just watching patients suffer and die, unable to do anything to help. Imagine being a doctor in the 1920s. You know that your patient has pneumonia. You know that the infection is spreading through their lungs. You know they're probably going to die. And there is nothing you can do except try to keep them comfortable and hope their immune system can fight it off. That must have been incredibly frustrating and depressing. A lot of doctors burned out or became cynical because they felt so helpless. After penicillin, being a doctor became a completely different job. Suddenly you could actually cure people. You could take someone who was dying and make them better. That must have been incredibly satisfying and rewarding. It changed not just what doctors could do, but how they thought about medicine. Before antibiotics, medicine was about managing disease and helping people cope. After antibiotics, medicine became about curing disease and restoring health. That shift in mindset led to all sorts of other medical advances. If you can cure bacterial infections, what else can you cure? Cancer, heart disease, Alzheimer's? That optimism drove a lot of medical research in the second half of the 20th century. But there's a darker side to this story too. The development of penicillin happened during World War II, and that's not a coincidence. Wars have always driven medical innovation because there's this urgent need to keep soldiers alive and fighting. A lot of medical advances, from surgery techniques to blood transfusions to antibiotics, came out of wartime research. But that raises some uncomfortable questions. Would we have developed penicillin as quickly if there hadn't been a war creating that urgency? How many other potential medical advances are we not pursuing because there's no urgent need driving the research? And there's the question of who benefits from medical advances. Penicillin was developed in Britain with government funding, then mass-produced in the United States with government support. The pharmaceutical companies that made it got rich, but they didn't discover it or figure out how to make it work. The scientists who did the actual work didn't get rich. Fleming, Florey, and Chain got recognition and prizes, but they didn't patent their discovery. Meanwhile, millions of people benefited from their work without paying them directly. Is that fair? Should they have patented penicillin and made money from it? Or were they right to give it away freely? These questions don't have easy answers, but they're important to think about. The penicillin story raises fundamental questions about how we fund research, who owns scientific discoveries, and how we distribute the benefits of those discoveries. These same questions apply to all sorts of medical advances today. Who should pay for developing new medicines? Should pharmaceutical companies be allowed to charge high prices for drugs that people need to survive? How do we balance the need for profit, which drives innovation, with the need for access, which saves lives? Let's talk about some of the other patients who were treated with early penicillin, because their stories are interesting too. After Albert Alexander died, Florey and Chain treated several other patients. One was a 15-year-old boy named Arthur Jones, who had a blood infection after a hip operation. They treated him with penicillin and he recovered completely. Another was a man with a strep infection that was destroying his muscles. Penicillin saved his life. A woman with blood poisoning after childbirth was cured. Each success proved that penicillin really worked, that Albert Alexander's case wasn't just a fluke. One of the most famous early cases was Ann Miller, an American woman who got a strep infection after a miscarriage in 1942. She was dying. Her temperature was over 106 degrees, and nothing was working. Her doctor managed to get some of the very limited supply of penicillin available in the United States at that time. They gave it to her, and within hours her fever dropped. Within days she was recovering. She lived until 1999, more than 50 years later, and she always said that penicillin gave her a second chance at life. She became one of the first people in the United States to be saved by penicillin. These early patients became walking proof of what penicillin could do. When the government and pharmaceutical companies were deciding whether to invest in mass production, they could point to these real people who had been saved. It's one thing to show data from mouse experiments. It's another thing entirely to show a person who is dying and is now healthy because of your medicine. These patients and their families became advocates for penicillin, telling their stories and helping convince people that this was worth pursuing. There's also an interesting story about how penicillin was used in World War II. The military didn't just use it to treat wounded soldiers. They also used it to treat sexually transmitted infections, which were a huge problem in the military. Soldiers would get infected, and before penicillin, treatment took weeks or months and wasn't always effective. With penicillin, they could be cured in days and sent back to their units. The military kept detailed records of how penicillin was used, and those records showed just how effective it was. Those records helped convince people after the war that penicillin should be made available to civilians. But there were also ethical issues with how penicillin was used during and after the war. When supplies were limited, who got access? Soldiers got priority over civilians. White soldiers sometimes got priority over black soldiers. Wealthy people who could afford to pay for scarce penicillin got it, while poor people didn't. These inequalities reflected broader inequalities in society, and they show that even a miracle drug doesn't automatically make things fair. Access to medicine is always shaped by social, economic, and political factors. After the war, there was a black market for penicillin in some places. People would steal it from hospitals or military supplies and sell it at high prices to desperate families. The quality of this black market penicillin was often questionable. Sometimes it was diluted or contaminated. Sometimes it wasn't even real penicillin at all. People died because they got fake penicillin instead of the real thing. This problem got better as production increased and prices dropped, but it shows how desperate people were for access to this medicine. There's also the story of how different countries approached penicillin production. The United States took a very capitalist approach, with multiple private companies competing to produce it more efficiently. Britain tried a more coordinated approach with government involvement. The Soviet Union set up its own production facilities and refused to rely on imports from Western countries. Each approach had advantages and disadvantages. The American approach led to rapid innovation and massive production, but also to high prices initially. The British approach was more equitable but slower to scale up. The Soviet approach gave them independence but meant they were starting from scratch. These different approaches shaped not just penicillin production, but the pharmaceutical industry more broadly. The United States became the dominant force in pharmaceutical development, with large companies investing heavily in research and development. Other countries developed their own industries but often struggled to compete. This has created a global system where most new drugs are developed in a few wealthy countries, then sold around the world. That system has led to a lot of innovation, but it's also created inequalities in access and pricing. Let me tell you about some of the challenges that Florey and Chain faced that don't usually get mentioned. When they were trying to grow penicillin, they had to figure out what nutrients the mold needed. They tried all sorts of different growth media, different temperatures, different levels of oxygen. It was tedious trial and error work. They had to keep the mold from getting contaminated by other microorganisms. They had to figure out how to extract the penicillin without destroying it. Every single step was a puzzle they had to solve. And they were doing all this during wartime in Britain. The lab was in Oxford, and German planes were bombing British cities. They had to do their research under wartime conditions. With limited resources, frequent air raid sirens, and the constant worry that their lab might be bombed. At one point, they even made plans for what they would do if Germany invaded Britain. They decided they would destroy all their equipment and notes except for small samples of the penicillin mold, which they would rub into the linings of their coats so they could smuggle it out of the country if they had to flee. Think about that. They were so committed to preserving this discovery that they were willing to risk their lives to save samples of a mold. That's how important they knew this was. That's how dedicated they were to making sure this discovery didn't get lost. Fortunately, they never had to execute that plan, but the fact that they made it shows how serious the situation was and how determined they were. There were also personal costs to their work. Florey and Chain worked incredibly long hours. They neglected their families, their health, their other interests. Chain in particular was known for being obsessive about his work. He would spend days in the lab without sleeping, trying to solve some problem with the penicillin purification process. That kind of dedication is admirable, but it also takes a toll. Several of the researchers working on penicillin suffered from exhaustion and stress-related health problems. And there were tensions within the team. Florey and Chain didn't always get along. They had different personalities and different approaches to research. Florey was practical and focused on getting results. Chain was more interested in the theoretical aspects and understanding exactly how penicillin worked. Sometimes these differences led to disagreements about what they should prioritize. But despite these tensions, they managed to work together effectively enough to achieve their goal. That's another important lesson from this story. You don't have to be best friends with your colleagues to do great work together. You just have to respect each other's contributions and stay focused on your shared goal. Let's also talk about the women who contributed to the penicillin story because they often get left out. I mentioned Mary Hunt, Moldy Mary, but there were many other women involved. In Florey's lab at Oxford, much of the tedious work of growing the mold, extracting the penicillin, and running tests was done by female laboratory assistants and technicians. These women did crucial work, but their names were often not included in the publications and they didn't get much recognition. One woman who should be mentioned is Norman Heatley. Wait, Norman is usually a male name, but in this case, Norman Heatley was actually a man. But I want to talk about the female technicians who worked under him. Heatley was the biochemist who figured out many of the practical techniques for growing and extracting penicillin. He supervised a team that included several women who did the actual hands-on work. They would grow the mold, harvest it, extract the penicillin, test its potency over and over again. It was repetitive, demanding work that required great attention to detail. Without them, Florey and Chain couldn't have done their research. This was typical of science at that time. Women could work in labs as technicians and assistants, but they rarely got the top positions or the recognition. Their contributions were essential, but often invisible. The penicillin story is partly a story about these invisible workers whose names we don't know, but whose work made everything else possible. It's a reminder that when we celebrate scientific breakthroughs, we should think about all the people who contributed, not just the famous names. Now, let's think about what the world would be like if penicillin had never been discovered. Or more accurately, what if it had been discovered but never developed into a practical medicine? Because remember, Fleming discovered it in 1928. But it wasn't widely available until the 1940s. What if it had stayed in that limbo forever? Just an interesting laboratory observation that never became useful? Millions more people would have died. World War II would have been even deadlier, with infections killing far more soldiers. The post-war population boom probably wouldn't have happened, or would have been smaller, because more young people would have died from infections. Medical procedures that we take for granted today, like organ transplants or chemotherapy for cancer, wouldn't be possible because the risk of infection would be too high. Life expectancy would be lower. Parents would still routinely lose children to infections. Pregnancy and childbirth would still be much more dangerous for women. But here's something interesting. If penicillin had never been developed, we probably would have put a lot more effort into developing other ways to fight infections. Maybe we would have discovered other antibiotics sooner. Maybe we would have developed better vaccines. Maybe we would have invested more in public health measures like sanitation and hygiene. The absence of penicillin might have pushed us to find different solutions. We can't know for sure, but it's possible that we would have ended up in a similar place eventually, just by a different path. Or maybe not. Maybe penicillin was crucial for opening up the whole field of antibiotics. Maybe without that breakthrough, we wouldn't have known to look for other antibiotic-producing microorganisms. Maybe we would still be living in a world where infections kill millions of people every year. It's impossible to know. But it makes you appreciate just how important that one discovery was, and how much we owe to the people who made it happen. There's one more aspect of this story I want to talk about, and that's the role of luck. Yes, Fleming worked hard and was observant. Yes, Florey and Chain were brilliant and determined. Yes, the US government and pharmaceutical companies invested massive resources. But there was also a lot of luck involved. Fleming happened to be working with bacteria that were susceptible to penicillin. The contaminating mold happened to land on that particular petri dish. Chain happened to read Fleming's old paper. Mary Hunt happened to find a cantaloupe with a super productive mold strain. The US happened to enter World War II, creating the urgency for mass production. At any of those points, things could have gone differently. Fleming might have been working with different bacteria. The mold might never have contaminated his petri dish. Chain might never have come across that paper. Mary Hunt might never have found that cantaloupe. The US might have stayed out of the war. And if any of those things had happened differently, penicillin might never have become the world-changing medicine that it is. This raises a philosophical question. How much of progress is due to human effort and skill, and how much is due to luck and chance? The penicillin story suggests that it's both. You need the luck of having the right circumstances, but you also need people who are prepared to recognize and act on those lucky breaks. Fleming was lucky that the mold contaminated his petri dish, but he was also prepared to recognize that this was significant. Florey and Chain were lucky that Fleming had published his findings, but they were also prepared to do the hard work of turning those findings into a practical medicine. Maybe the lesson is that we should create conditions where lucky breaks are more likely to happen and more likely to be recognized. That means funding lots of different research projects, even ones that seem unlikely to succeed. It means encouraging scientists to publish their findings even when they don't seem immediately useful. It means training scientists to be observant and curious. It means creating systems where good ideas can get the support they need to be developed. We can't control luck, but we can create environments where luck is more likely to lead to progress. Hit subscribe if you want to see more stories about decisions that change the world. Think about that. They were so committed to preserving this discovery that they were willing to risk their lives to save samples of a mold. That's how important they knew this was. That's how dedicated they were to making sure this discovery didn't get lost. Fortunately, they never had to execute that plan, but the fact that they made it shows how serious the situation was and how determined they were. There were also personal costs to their work. Florey and Chain worked incredibly long hours. They neglected their families, their health, their other interests. Chain in particular was known for being obsessive about his work. He would spend days in the lab without sleeping, trying to solve some problem with the penicillin purification process. That kind of dedication is admirable, but it also takes a toll. Several of the researchers working on penicillin suffered from exhaustion and stress-related health problems. And there were tensions within the team. Florey and Chain didn't always get along. They had different personalities and different approaches to research. Florey was practical and focused on getting results. Chain was more interested in the theoretical aspects and understanding exactly how penicillin worked. Sometimes these differences led to disagreements about what they should prioritize. But despite these tensions, they managed to work together effectively enough to achieve their goal. That's another important lesson from this story. You don't have to be best friends with your colleagues to do great work together. You just have to respect each other's contributions and stay focused on your shared goal. Let's also talk about the women who contributed to the penicillin story because they often get left out. I mentioned Mary Hunt, Moldy Mary, but there were many other women involved. In Florey's lab at Oxford, much of the tedious work of growing the mold, extracting the penicillin, and running tests was done by female laboratory assistants and technicians. These women did crucial work, but their names were often not included in the publications, and they didn't get much recognition. One woman who should be mentioned is Norman Heatley. Wait, Norman is usually a male name, but in this case, Norman Heatley was actually a man. But I want to talk about the female technicians who worked under him. Heatley was the biochemist who figured out many of the practical techniques for growing and extracting penicillin. He supervised a team that included several women who did the actual hands-on work. They would grow the mold, harvest it, extract the penicillin, test its potency over and over again. It was repetitive, demanding work that required great attention to detail. Without them, Florey and Chain couldn't have done their research. This was typical of science at that time. Women could work in labs as technicians and assistants, but they rarely got the top positions or the recognition. Their contributions were essential, but often invisible. The penicillin story is partly a story about these invisible workers whose names we don't know, but whose work made everything else possible. It's a reminder that when we celebrate scientific breakthroughs, we should think about all the people who contributed, not just the famous names. Now, let's think about what the world would be like if penicillin had never been discovered. Or more accurately, what if it had been discovered but never developed into a practical medicine? Because remember, Fleming discovered it in 1928. But it wasn't widely available until the 1940s. What if it had stayed in that limbo forever? Just an interesting laboratory observation that never became useful? Millions more people would have died. World War II would have been even deadlier, with infections killing far more soldiers. The post-war population boom probably wouldn't have happened, or would have been smaller, because more young people would have died from infections. Medical procedures that we take for granted today, like organ transplants or chemotherapy for cancer, wouldn't be possible because the risk of infection would be too high. Life expectancy would be lower. Parents would still routinely lose children to infections. Pregnancy and childbirth would still be much more dangerous for women. But here's something interesting. If penicillin had never been developed, we probably would have put a lot more effort into developing other ways to fight infections. Maybe we would have discovered other antibiotics sooner. Maybe we would have developed better vaccines. Maybe we would have invested more in public health measures like sanitation and hygiene. The absence of penicillin might have pushed us to find different solutions. We can't know for sure, but it's possible that we would have ended up in a similar place eventually, just by a different path. Or maybe not. Maybe penicillin was crucial for opening up the whole field of antibiotics. Maybe without that breakthrough, we wouldn't have known to look for other antibiotic-producing microorganisms. Maybe we would still be living in a world where infections kill millions of people every year. It's impossible to know. But it makes you appreciate just how important that one discovery was, and how much we owe to the people who made it happen. There's one more aspect of this story I want to talk about, and that's the role of luck. Yes, Fleming worked hard and was observant. Yes, Florey and Chain were brilliant and determined. Yes, the US government and pharmaceutical companies invested massive resources. But there was also a lot of luck involved. Fleming happened to be working with bacteria that were susceptible to penicillin. The contaminating mold happened to land on that particular petri dish. Chain happened to read Fleming's old paper. Mary Hunt happened to find a cantaloupe with a super productive mold strain. The US happened to enter World War II, creating the urgency for mass production. At any of those points, things could have gone differently. Fleming might have been working with different bacteria. The mold might never have contaminated his petri dish. Chain might never have come across that paper. Mary Hunt might never have found that cantaloupe. The US might have stayed out of the war. And if any of those things had happened differently, penicillin might never have become the world-changing medicine that it is. This raises a philosophical question. How much of progress is due to human effort and skill, and how much is due to luck and chance? The penicillin story suggests that it's both. You need the luck of having the right circumstances, but you also need people who are prepared to recognize and act on those lucky breaks. Fleming was lucky that the mold contaminated his petri dish, but he was also prepared to recognize that this was significant. Florey and Chain were lucky that Fleming had published his findings, but they were also prepared to do the hard work of turning those findings into a practical medicine. Maybe the lesson is that we should create conditions where lucky breaks are more likely to happen and more likely to be recognized. That means funding lots of different research projects, even ones that seem unlikely to succeed. It means encouraging scientists to publish their findings even when they don't seem immediately useful. It means training scientists to be observant and curious. It means creating systems where good ideas can get the support they need to be developed. We can't control luck, but we can create environments where luck is more likely to lead to progress. Hit subscribe if you want to see more stories about decisions that changed the world.